open textbooks. And this was a topic especially of interest to our many faculty members, and we had visitors from Northwest Community College as well. So as we're moving into the digital age, even the big 500-page textbook is becoming obsolete, and of course it's too expensive for many students. I didn't object too much, although as a writer of textbooks, I was saying, well, what about us? So my name is Phil Burton. I'm the regional chair here. Most of you have probably seen me before, as you are probably even more familiar with our speaker today, Dr. John Krisinger, who is a professor at the Northwest Community College. He teaches into our joint nursing program and also the biology program. John comes to us with a PhD in pharmacology, earned in Germany. He did postdoc work in biochemistry at the University of Wisconsin, and he was on the faculty of medicine at UBC for a number of years as well. And so he comes to us today with a very interesting topic. We like to have something a little controversial every semester. And in fact, I would remind you of that fact as we look for more speakers next semester, and also as we engage in discussion. We would like to host all sides of different issues, pro and con, popular and unpopular. So we'll see where John leads us today in this discussion of medicinal use of marijuana. Take it away, John.
Thank you. Well, I guess the title tells you already in what direction my talk will go. Let me just do a little preamble. It's actually very difficult to talk to lay people about pharmacology. Obviously, you need to know the drugs, and whether they have any effect, you need to know the disease. So for my pharmacology course, a pathophysiology, a disease course, is a prerequisite. And to understand diseases, you got to go back and learn the human anatomy and physiology when it's working before you understand diseases. So, and then the prerequisite for that is chemistry and basic biology. So pharmacology is an advanced subject. That's all there is to it. So it is not that easy to grasp, and it's very complicated. So I want to do three things. First, I want to see what do we know about the endogenous cannabinoid system. So what does it do, and what is known about its effects. And second, then I want to look at what is actually pot, what is the cannabis plant and how is it used. And then I will conclude with the views that the medical authorities have about that very issue of medical use of this material. So obviously the reason why pot has an effect on our behavior and all kinds of things is there is an internal system that uses chemicals that relate to this. And for the longest time, we didn't know that. Same thing with opiates. We didn't know that there are chemicals in our brain and spinal cord that act like morphine. So the same thing here. So through the plant effect, we found the endogenous system. So those compounds, obviously, they act in the brain and the peripheral nervous system. They are said to be neuromodulators. I'll show you what that means. And in a nutshell, they affect lots of things like appetite, pain sensation, mood, and memory. So, by the way, I upload, or Alex will upload my presentation to a website, and please, if you want to download it and read the whole thing, I will run out of time if I stick to all my slides. So what I do, I only focus on the red stuff, but I left the black stuff in there for yourself to read, to not to run out of time. So here's what neuromodulation is. Unfortunately, again, here's a lot of basic biology at work. We have about 1 billion neurons in our head alone, in our brain. And it's electrical currents that send signals down the axons, but it's chemicals that are used to communicate between two cells. Those are the neurotransmitters, so they're released once an action potential arrives here. So and then the recipient cell that listens to that signal must have receptor proteins, or else it wouldn't respond to those little chemicals. By the way, here's the thing I teach my students in first year. The brain could theoretically use one single neurotransmitter to run everything. That's how your house works. You have electricity to open a garage door or run a coffee machine. The body could do that. Evolution could have done this because the chemical that's released here has no way to affect other neurons that regulate something else. It's completely local. That's why it's orderly. Now pour a drug into your head, which is what medications are. A drug will go anywhere where the receptor binds to it. So you have no specificity. You can't tell a drug molecule go only to this synapse and not to others. It will go everywhere. That's how hormones, by the way, work. So now, what does the cannabis do? See a little picture here. What neuromodulation now means, cannabis binds to the the sending cell, and it can modulate this. And in either case, there are two different mechanisms where cannabis will reduce the firing of these neurotransmitters. That's what they mean by modulation. So it will decrease. That's what this little red block means. By the way, opiates work exactly like that. In pain fibers in the spinal cord, they also depress the action of pain pathways. So, now the chemical is actually very simple in our body. This is a long fatty acid called arachidonic acid, and then it has a little aminoacenol attached to it. And that is the signal that neurons produce to modulate our nervous system activity. There's another chemical, it's very related. It's just written in a mirror image here. The only real difference is this group here. T2AG is also an endocannabinoid. And of course, they're named because cannabis has a chemical that acts through the same receptors, and THC is the short name for tetrahydrocannabinol. So now, many neurotransmitters are degraded in the brain thereby using the mechanism to decrease their activity. And the endogenous cannabinoids are degraded by this enzyme here. I call it short FAAH. Right now you may wonder, why do you tell us this little detail? Just wait. That is of great significance. So, very simple mechanism. You have an active neuromodulator, the enzyme clips this off, and you have an inactive compound. Now, those receptor proteins through which the cannabis compounds act, we have two kinds, so they're different proteins. They're found in different locations, and they explain the effects. For example, the CB1 receptor is by far the more interesting one. It's the one that makes people high. So it has multiple locations in the brain affecting motor control, short-term memory, abstract thinking, appetite, and sedation or alertness. So no wonder it's far-reaching consequences if you tinker with this receptor. The CB2 receptor is found in the peripheral nervous system as well as in white blood cells. So people have thought maybe that has something to do with the immune system because white blood cells are the warriors in there. But we don't understand too much about it. Certainly that has to do with its role in pain perception. Now, why do I have this slide here? To give you just a hint. Neurobiology is incredibly complicated. These receptors are very large proteins. They go in and out the membrane 7 times, and then they have a system that they drive inside the neuron, which uses a series of cascades of proteins that turn on enzymes. So it's called a signal transduction cascade. And even it feeds all the way down to regulating gene transcription. So ultimately, we have Andy Krisinger here. We don't know what memory really is when it comes to hardware. What is in your head tomorrow, which formed the memory, which had formed memory today? We don't know what that really is. But we do know to form memories, you have to turn on genes and make new proteins. So that much we know. So anyway, cannabinoids have an effect on such processes. Very convoluted. Now in science for over 20 years, we can make what's called knockout mouse. It's very simple. If you want to know what a spark plug does in a car, in an engine, just take it out. See what doesn't work anymore. It's exactly what we do with genes. So if you take out the CB1 receptor gene in a mouse, then you study what's wrong with you now when you don't have the endocannabinoids anymore. Just to highlight a few things, they're alive and well. They're a lot thinner. Mice overeat if you give them really high caloric food and they get fat. Those ones don't. They have major problems in their memory of learning, memory retrieval, and who know that mice in captivity can get strokes and seizures. So when they live long enough, they have all the diseases that we have too, including cancer. So the CB2 knockout mouse shows less abnormalities. There is different types of fear they study in these animals. They put them in certain settings and scare them. And it is altered but it's not as drastic as the CB1 receptor. Now, you probably are aware that we sequence the human genome. And of course, today, sequencing has become so cheap. We have now sequenced thousands of people's genomes. So now we know that people are actually very different from each other. It's a funny idea that, oh, we're all one species. No, that's why you look different from the guy who sits next to you. There's a lot of polymorphism, means many shapes in our genome. And we're becoming more and more aware, for example, important genes, in this case, the gene that makes the CB2 receptor, some people have a different version of this. And so being aware of this explains why so many people respond differently to drugs, including medications. In fact, there's a word for this. They call it pharmacogenomics. It explains the science behind why does this drug do something different in him than in her. Shouldn't have used male or female here, it doesn't matter. So this variation of the CB2 receptor is related to schizophrenia, depression, and bipolar disorder. Now, people also have made combined knockout mice where both cannabinoid receptors are removed. And again, there's all sorts of differences. And here's a weird thing, that's why I highlighted this. If you give a mouse like that cannabis, there's still an effect. So somehow that tells us there is other proteins that are relaying signals in response to those endogenous cannabinoids, and we don't know too much about it. Certainly some of those have to do with temperature control and again with pain. Now here's the reason why I mentioned that enzyme. So this is the cannabis, endogenous cannabis degrading enzyme. So in a healthy person, you would have a certain level of activity of this signal system. And if a person has an enzyme defect, and some people do, so people have a malfunctioning FAAH enzyme, so then naturally their endocannabinoid levels are elevated. And they are different from normal people. They have reduced pain perception, reduced anxiety. People like this have less likely the development of post-traumatic stress disorder. So, and the industry is well aware of this. This is not really new. There are now drugs in development. Probably, I would guess, a quarter of all medications, by principle, they are enzyme inhibitors. You have an enzyme that's doing something and you want to enhance it, well, block the enzyme. And here, that's where the idea comes from. You could boost the endogenous cannabinoid system if you have an enzyme inhibitor. And so there are drugs already in clinical trials, and they are designed to be used in neuropathic pain and Crohn's disease, inflammatory bowel disease. Now, what about the effects in a bigger picture? Again, here they're looking at the knockout mouse. There's certainly effect also on long-term memory. It's very interesting. The knockout mouse has an enhanced memory. It's an enhanced memory. So it seems like cannabis' natural role is to purge neurons from building unnecessary memory. We all know that short-term memory, if you were to memorize a phone number, it's good enough to know it until you dialed it, but it's a waste of space to try to memorize that number ad infinitum. So it seems like the cannabinoids have something to do with this. Now, appetite, anything you look into what regulates the brain or what the brain regulates gets very complicated when you start looking into the matter more deeply. So somehow the reason why cannabis has an effect on appetite, because it's linked to a very powerful hormone that stimulates satiety. Like that mouse here, the only thing that's missing is the leptin gene. So the mouse has lost the mechanism to feel full, so it just keeps eating. So somehow the effect on appetite loops via the endocannabinoid receptor ultimately on these leptin circuits. Now, obviously, that definitely has something to do with the munchies that pot users are familiar with, that they develop an appetite. Another peculiar thing, I mean, we're all humans. You probably know sometimes you feel like eating something sweet, and other times you prefer something salty. Well, that's all driven by the brain too, and we don't really know exactly what that is. But the munchies apparently have a preference for sweet delights rather than salty ones. Now here again, another little side comment. When people understood the effect on appetite, the industry is for decades looking for safe and effective drugs to suppress appetite. And they have all come and gone. They work, but they're not safe. And here's another one. So they made a THC receptor blocker. Very logic. Take out what the cannabinoids do by blocking the receptor. Rimonabant is the chemical. Complia was the brand name. It was on the market less than half a year. We found out the side effects are suicides. So people's mood changed to a point that they commit suicide. Obviously, very interesting note. If you give a non-opiate addict naloxone, it's famous in the news all the time, if you're not under extreme stress, the opiate system seems to do nothing. So if I was to take naloxone, I would have no effect. That's not true for the endocannabinoid system, because if that was true, then rimonabant shouldn't do anything, but it does. It suppresses your appetite and it makes your mood go down the drain. So obviously the cannabinoid system is doing something all the time, not like the opiate system. Stress, another very big can of worms. What the heck is stress? There's immediate stress, the adrenaline response, and then there's the much more problematic role of prolonged stress, which is mediated by the adrenal glands. They make a hormone called cortisol. And again, if you start reading what the heck does cortisol do, it regulates hundreds of genes. It affects all organs. And so it's very convoluted to make sense of this. And it certainly seems to be true that cannabinoids decrease that prolonged stress response. You can easily measure. You just measure cortisol levels. Now again, some effects in mice, the behavior, explorative behavior, social behavior changes. And here again is a mess. I mentioned cannabis decreases the release of neurotransmitters. But which ones? Well, we know there are two neurotransmitters that are inhibited. Glutamate is a neurotransmitter that always excites the cells that gets it. So it activates a circuit. Gamma aminobutyric acid is an inhibitor. So when it fires, it tells the cell, the receiving cell, do not fire. That's basically a downer, if I can put it that way. It makes you sleepy. By the way, Valium works by binding to GABA receptor, exaggerating that part. So now, you might have heard that some people propose to use cannabis in epileptic seizure treatment. Well, as it turns out, it does work in some people, and it actually triggers seizures in other people, because it depends how these systems work. If you inhibit this, you trigger a seizure. In fact, we have GABA receptor blocker that are used as experimental drugs. They provoke epilepsy. So in some people, pot can do that too. In most, it doesn't. What about the immune system? So since white blood cells have a CB1 receptor, why is it there? White blood cells are the warriors of my immune system. There's very little evidence that it does anything. Multiple sclerosis, again, is a disease. Very complicated to understand what's going on in MS. MS has two problems. The origin, which is an autoimmune attack. The white blood cells consider the basic myelin protein that insulates axon as foreign, which it shouldn't. So it starts to destroy this. You got inflammation, and neurons eventually malfunction and die. This is the real origin of the disease. Now the consequences, of course, are neurological symptoms. So now those neurons that are being damaged malfunction. Now you have all the symptoms. It seems the only benefit that we might see in MS is not a result of attacking the cause of the problem, but patching up some of the symptoms. And no wonder. Endocannabinoids affect neural function, and that you can patch that up a bit in some people. Well, here's a list of beneficial effects. Again, the industry is well aware of this. We have drugs, over a dozen, that address the cause of the problem. They're very expensive, and some of them work like miracles, others don't. Again, MS is not one disease. It's a whole family. People have different versions of MS. It's very complicated. Now the story about pain is also extremely convoluted. Don't want to read through all this. There is another chemical mediator that is detected in pain perception. And so definitely there is a effect on chronic pain. There's no doubt about this. In some people that's beneficial. Thermoregulation, obviously another thing. How the heck does your body know what 37 degrees are? And how can it so finely adjust this? Well, obviously the nervous system does this. And vasodilation is the major way when we're too hot. We widen blood vessels in the periphery to get rid of heat. And that probably has to do why people have red eyes when they smoke pot. It's the vasodilation resulting from that. Now, sleep promotion, no wonder about this. So if you tinker with this GABA system again, you might influence sleeping behavior, so it's actually beneficial in that sense. Now, why do people like to get high? It's very interesting. There's so many chemicals that make people addicted, and they do, at first, very different things. What do they have in common? And you will see when you read the literature, in common, they have, eventually, you activate neurons that use dopamine. The reward circuits are the dopaminergic neurons. Dopamine does all kinds of other things that have nothing to do with pleasure. But interestingly, many neurotransmitters, including the endogenous cannabinoids, eventually feed back onto dopamine neurons. And the strange thing is, it even involves opiate receptors. So somehow, you smoke a dope, the THC turns on the cannabinoid receptors, they somehow activate opiate receptors, and they somehow loop finally onto dopamine receptors, giving you pleasure. So because we know that, because naloxone can block some of the pot effects, well, that tells you they're all linked together. Oh, I wanted to comment on this here. If you're healthy, don't take drugs. That's fine, a basic rule. So this whole system of cannabinoids is working at a certain level in people, and if you add drugs to it, you basically add an enormous excess amount of stimulation to those poor receptors, and cells adapt. They can downregulate the number of receptors. That's why, for example, a heroin addict can tolerate sometimes hundreds of milligrams of morphine, which would kill a horse, and of course any person. It's simply because you have anatomical changes. They take out their receptors. And interestingly, some of those processes are irreversible. So once you have modified this, we know that from LSD too, people are left with permanent, may I call it brain damage? We have changed your brain, so it's a damage at that level. Now let me just quickly look at a few acute effects. So when people actually smoke pot, inhalation is an unbelievable fast, furious exposure. The lungs have a surface of about 1,500 square feet, like a little house, and it's meant to very quickly move oxygen and carbon dioxide. And it will move just as fast any volatile lipophilic compounds. So nicotine and THC, within about 12 seconds after inhalation, they are in the brain. So it's very fast. And therefore you get a very high concentration temporarily, and that's the buzz when people smoke these things. On the contrary, the all around is very much slower. You don't have this drastic peak. I'll show you some graphs here. Anyway, there's a whole list of more acute effects you can read at your own pleasure. Now once more, memory. In fact, I have to teach about all these drugs. We have date rape drugs. That's exactly what it's supposed to do. Anterograph amnesia. So you're unable to form memory, so you don't remember what happened. So we have drugs that are very good at that. Pot can do it somewhat, of course, not as drastic as that term might imply. However, today we have cannabis on the market that is so concentrated that when you look at the old literature, cannabis would not be described as a hallucinogenic drug. Now it is. We have so concentrated materials now that it actually sends people into hallucinations, given the right dose, delusions and paranoia. Anyway, let me skip this one. The story about lethality. Some people think because something isn't lethal at a very high dose, that it's kind of harmless. Not very convincing to me. All it says is the cannabis receptors do not regulate anything that's vital. It doesn't regulate your respiration like opiates do. You can get killed from the fentanyl overdose that we hear all the time. It doesn't regulate cardiovascular function like cocaine will do that in an overdose. So those receptors simply regulate things that are not vital. That's all there is to it. So there's no lethalis doses, 50%, that's the technical term for this. There are rare complications that people present themselves at the emergency departments, and they're all basically psychotic states of panic attacks, convulsions, that sort of thing, but they're not life-threatening. Now, physical health, of course, when people smoke, I'll tell you later a bit more about the pyrolysis. Of course, there's tar, there's carbon monoxide, there are polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are powerful carcinogens. In that regard, it's actually a little worse than ordinary tobacco. Now, what about chronic use of pot? So we know there's a correlation to depression, anxiety, personality. I always have to chuckle, I gotta tell you this. When I was teaching this in my class, the amotivational syndrome, so I described, people don't really show up for work, or they don't groom themselves properly, they miss appointments of any social kind as well. Up comes an arm, a lady and a more mature student, she says, "Yep, you described my husband, that's why I left the bugger." So anyway, and here's another story. Why do some people seem to go into schizophrenia? Obviously, you may or may not know, schizophrenia never starts in childhood. It starts typically in adolescence. So, and then, can you predict? Schizophrenia is not that uncommon. So then, was the pot use to blame for triggering it, or would it have developed anyway? So it's not easy to answer, but there are lots of studies that do show a link. And again, in certain people, you can read this, again, there's a polymorphism in a gene that seems to select some people more likely to become schizophrenic upon this drug use. Now, is it addictive? In fact, in my drug abuse class, I have a scale, I should have brought it. How addictive are drugs? The most addictive drug until now was heroin. Now you hear actually fentanyl because of its high lipophilicity is the word for how fat soluble a chemical is. And the brain is sheltered by what's called a blood-brain barrier. It's a membrane around blood vessels, and it cannot keep fat soluble things out. So the more fat soluble a compound is, the faster it will flood the brain. And that gives you the most intense rush. So fentanyl is even more lipophilic, fat soluble than heroin. And so pot is also THC is very lipophilic. So, but of course the addiction potential is far less than cocaine or heroin. But here are the facts. 30% of users have a degree of addiction. It's not black and white. You're not either an addict or you don't. There's certain degrees of being dependent. So, and here's some fact. Individuals using before the age of 18, so during adolescence, have a 4 to 7-fold increase of becoming dependent. So about 17% of users are described as really drug dependent. Now let me say a few words about the cannabis plant itself. So again, the active ingredient is one little chemical, and then a whole host of associated compounds. The content has changed over the years. It went up and up and up and up. So old studies that you find in the literature are useless. What's in there, the amounts that were used are so low, they have nothing to do anymore with the levels we see today. So it is highly variable. 10% is about the average content of THC that is. And here's my point as rational drug companies. They don't give you a joint and say smoke and tell me how you feel. That's not how you do pharmacology. When you do clean pharmacology, you use pure compounds. You use one, so you don't have a mess to deal with. And like, even if you were to let people smoke, fine, but measure plasma levels so you actually know what active dose is in that person you're studying. So a lot of research is just not doing this. So it's sort of biased and unscientific. Now obviously people that smoke pot use various plant parts that are richest in THC content. Hashish, I don't know how popular it is in BC, is merely another version to concentrate the ingredients, or people extract oils and then you can get up to 30 to 90% of pure THC. Now, so cannabis, like any plant, there are thousands of chemicals, and here's the little THC molecule. And of course, it's made by a biosynthetic pathway, and then there's degradation products. So no wonder there's a whole family of cannabinoids in that plant, not just one. It's one of the members of the terpenes. There are thousands of terpenes made by plants. So how many are in there? You can read the literature, and I don't have enough time to verify all this. Between 70 and 113 is reported. So a real mixed bag. Now, the two main ones that are of concern and that we know act is, of course, once more the THC. It's called tetrahydrocannabinol because it's an alcohol. And cannabidiol has two alcohol groups. And that second compound, there's very little in pot, but it's of very great interest for pharmacology. I'll tell you why. So the CBD lacks psychoactivity, so it doesn't get people high. It's far less in pot than THC. And so how come? What does it do? It acts via different receptors, so it gets very convoluted once more, and it has a lot of good effects if you have a problem. If you don't have, if you're not throwing up, if you're not psychotic, if you have no circulatory problems, you don't need any of this. A healthy person doesn't need it. But some people with certain illnesses might benefit from all the lovely effects. If the industry would have ever succeeded to make a morphine derivative that could do that, so what I'm saying is, if you could make a morphine compound that combats severe pain without depressing breathing, that's the holy grail they were trying to do for the last 100 years. It never worked. Here, it works. You have a compound that has many of the beneficial effects that we see in pot without making people high and addicted. So that would be considered a great achievement. So there we have a compound like that. Now the smoke. So obviously the plant itself would have thousands of chemicals in it. When you light it on fire, you create another mixture by pyrolysis, so by the fire. And then also, I hope you realize this, when you burn THC, it doesn't work anymore. It goes up into smoke. It's the THC that evaporates just in the vicinity of the fire. That's what we inhale. Same thing with nicotine. So probably a good part of the, not probably, a good part of the THC just burns. But it's what just behind the burning fire there is what's evaporating. That's what's active. Now here's something what Health Canada says about actual pot. It says marijuana, cannabis can be considered a very crude drug containing very large number of chemicals and pharmacological constituents, the properties of which are only slowly being understood. So anyway, not a very encouraging comment by them. The pharmacokinetics, that's the movement of drugs in the body. Once more, it's highly fat soluble, so that's why it's so rapidly absorbed in the alveoli, in the lungs. And that will cause a super spike in plasma, very short-lived, but extremely high. Now, smoking creates extremely variable levels in people's blood. In pharmacology, we call it bioavailability. Like if you swallow a tablet with 10 milligrams of something, and only about 2 ever show up in your blood, the bioavailability is 20%. Many drugs are like that. So, and it varies, and look how much, when people smoke joints, how much the bioavailability varies. A little bit, from 2 to 56%. It all depends how deep you inhale, how long you hold your breath, and what the cigarette is made of, how well it's burning, all these variables. By the way, vaporizing marijuana without burning it has similar issues of dosing problems. So here's a graph. Note the time scale here is in minutes, and then here's the plasma concentration, and the red, the round dots are the THC plasma levels. The others are metabolites. So you can see every arrow is an inhalation. So very quickly the levels rise. Take a note, so this experiment here, the level reaches about 150, that's nanograms per milliliter, 150. Wait until I show you some more numbers. So here is a graph that shows a smoking of marijuana, and then here is a metabolite. And the blue line here is an oral administration of marijuana. See, there's no spike because absorption through the gastrointestinal tract is very gradual. It's drawn out, so you don't have this spike. Did I just advance that? I must have done it unintentionally. So here's an excerpt from the drug company that makes Marinol. So it's a pure THC agonist on the market as an oral tablet. And so it's on the market for the indication of increasing appetite in AIDS patients. So the really, which we shouldn't have anymore because we have drugs to contain HIV. But if there are still people run down by AIDS to the point of that they're wasting away, those people would qualify for boosting their appetites. And people who are undergoing chemotherapy for cancer and they're struggling with nausea. So that company has a license to prescribe or sell them for this purpose. The dose that people use to reach the effects vary from 2.5 to 40 milligrams. That's also quite unusual that people require such vastly different doses. And here are the plasma levels reached in those studies. So here's the dose given singly, and here's the plasma level. Do you remember what the plasma level was when you smoke a joint? It was 150. So the therapeutic levels reach about 8 maximum when you use it as a real medication. That's a little different from 150, right? So the drug actually reaches all organs, no surprise. It even goes into your hair follicles. That's why you can find THC in people's hair. In forensics, they do that if you want to prove that you smoked pot in the past. It redistributes like so many other drugs. At first, the drug of this kind goes to the organs that have a very high blood supply, the brain. Your adipose tissue, your fat tissue, has a very low blood supply. But pot is very soluble there. So over time, it goes out of the brain, and then it starts to dissolve in the fat tissue. And that becomes a real depot for it. And now the half-life, so the time it takes to get rid of half of the pot, is about 30 hours. Now, if you do the math, if you smoke a joint every day, well, a day has only 24 hours. In 30 hours, you would have gotten rid of half of the pot in your system. So if you smoke a joint every day, you add more and more and more to this adipose tissue. It gets complicated. Eventually, you have an equilibrium, then you eliminate just as much as you put in. So there's accumulation. That's the reason why people score positive in THC tests for months, possibly if they were strong users and have stopped. Now here's some wisdom that I learned almost 30 years ago, or more than 30 years ago in my pharmacology training. Use as, well, if you're healthy, don't use drugs. Your body is designed by nature to work just fine without them. If you use drugs, use as few and as little as possible to reach the effect that we need. And I never forget this term here, polypragmatic shotgun therapy. In the old days, we had, for example, cold medications. There would be an antihistamine in there, a painkiller, a decongestant, an antitussive, that's a cough suppressor, and a sedative. That would be a polypragmatic nonsense therapy. If you have a stuffed nose and you can't breathe through your nose, take a decongestant. You don't need an antihistamine because you don't have an allergy. Basically, this is a fixed combination of drugs where probably few people really need them all, and then in a fixed combined dose. So this is not what we do normally. So marijuana now is a very complex mixture, as I pointed out. It's a pharmacological jungle because of the complexity of the compounds in there. So, and here's the interesting thing, lay people, I don't know where this comes from. Many people think because it's a plant, which is natural, that the combination is actually good for you. And well, Phil, we have studied evolution long enough. Evolution everybody fends for themselves. The marijuana plant has no interest of being beneficial to our brains. So the whole idea is irrational. There is no reason why this natural mixture would be naturally good. It is not. It is what it is. Now here's the statements of some authorities in the medical field about this whole thing. Let me start with the biggest authority in the world of medicine, that's the United States Food and Drug Administration. So yeah, I'll read this out to you. The term medical marijuana refers to using the whole unprocessed marijuana plant or its basic extracts to treat a disease or symptom. The FDA has not recognized or approved the marijuana plant as medicine. It's a pretty clear statement. The FDA requires careful conducted studies, clinical trials, in hundreds to thousands of human subjects to determine the benefits and risks of a possible medication. So far, researchers have not conducted enough large-scale clinical trials that show that the benefits of marijuana plant, as opposed to its cannabinoid ingredients, outweigh the risks in patients it is meant to treat. Furthermore, THC increases appetite and reduces nausea. The FDA-approved THC-based medications are used for these purposes. THC may also decrease pain, inflammation, and muscle control problems. This is the cannabidiol, is a cannabinoid that does not affect the mind or behavior. It may be useful in reducing pain and inflammation, controlling epileptic seizures, and possibly even treating mental illnesses and addiction. Now, our government's body, Health Canada, says the following. Cannabis is not an approved therapeutic product, and the provision of this information should not be interpreted as an endorsement of the use of this product or cannabis generally by Health Canada. But then they actually supply it. You can buy it through legal outlets, so that's sort of contradictory to me.
Just means they don't want to be sued.
Pardon?
Just means they don't want to be sued.
Yeah. So now, since I read German, I thought, what do the good old Germans have to say about this? So the Bundesärztekammer, that's their body of medical expertise that has a comment on this. And what they say, the only indication that's approved for cannabis is advanced MS, so multiple sclerosis. They have a comment on regarding the drug use in nausea associated with chemotherapy. I didn't know this when I teach pharmacology, and I know we have just a whole palette of drugs that suppress nausea and vomiting, because it's a huge problem in chemotherapy of cancer. People get very ill. We know that. And we have powerful drugs. Again, it shows your brain makes you puke, as we all know. Things you can see can provoke it. What you smell, what you taste. So obviously it's a neural directed thing. And we have drugs that affect the dopaminergic system, the acetylcholine system, the serotonin system, and the histamine system. So they're all neurotransmitters. They have something to do with throwing up. The weakest ones are the antihistamines. You can buy over the counter. They won't work in chemotherapy. But we have powerful antiemetic drugs that block serotonin, and that's the standard drug. And the good old Germans actually say that the cannabis is really a much less powerful drug than what we already have, so they see no real point to use it. And they even say, treating loss of appetite in AIDS, they say that the evidence that we see, it doesn't work. Okay, so here's more from the German authorities. So regarding chronic pain, recommendation is to use cannabinoids in patients with chronic pain, especially in palliative settings. I hope you know what palliative settings are. These are people who are terminally ill. So look at what the Germans say. I love this. Adverse effects are of positive value. So basically that you get high and that it promotes your sleep and that you have no nausea at that stage of your life might be beneficial, rather than if you're still not in palliative care and you're supposed to have a working life to participate in. Anyway, so what else would they say? The German statement does not even mention the use of smoking at all. Neither do they approve any of the whole extract of cannabis. So they talk about the pure drugs that are on the market. Now, what do we have on the market? SATIVA is available in Canada. is actually a mixture. The plant makes way more. I think it's about a 100 to 1, most species, most varieties of cannabis. So THC outnumbers CBD by about 100 to 1. This mixture here that's on the market deliberately has them almost equal. So, because there's very much benefit and no euphoria caused by CBD. So it's on the market, approved in Canada for pain relief for multiple sclerosis and cancer. And it's sprayed, so you can inhale it, it's not smoked. Pure CBD, which would be a very desirable drug, it's not on the market yet. It's in clinical trials for certain people with epilepsy that doesn't seem to respond to other treatments. And then Marinol is not on the market in Canada, but it is on the market in many other countries. That would be pure THC. So anyway, here is the Nabilone Sesamid that's on the market in Canada. That's basically a man-made THC analog. So it's not really THC from the plant, but it acts just like it. So it's also on the market as antiemetic, so against vomiting and painkiller. Anyway, so I want to conclude, but I want to stop here. If you download my paper or you Google this, here are 3 references where a lot of the information can be looked up. So the first one is a paper, well, it's not a paper, it's digital. That's why I don't know how many pages it is. Where am I pointing at? The top one here. So it's by Health Canada. It's information on cannabis for health professionals. I don't know how long it is, but it has exactly 1,000 references. And it's highly structured. If you want to know about MS, about vomiting, anything is in there. And then we have another link here, Effect of Cannabis During Adolescence. This is published by the Canadian Centre on Substance Abuse. That one is a 97-page document. I don't know how many references it has because they're not numbered. So that's a very interesting paper. It studies the effects when people start using pot in their adolescence. In fact, we had a workshop at the college in May. One of the authors was here. Very interesting. And if you dare to read German, well, there's the paper from the German authority about this that I used for my talk. So anyway, I think that's my last slide. So I'm happy, if I can, to answer any questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, John. So certainly we have questions. I'll just open it up and also give our website where you can download the archived version with the slides while you guys talk.
Go ahead.
Hi. I didn't get to listen to the whole lecture because I was teaching, but did you address pregnancy and cannabis users and impact on fetal development or anything like that?
I did not.
Okay.
That Canadian document that I referred to has a whole chapter on that.
Okay.
There's conflicting effects on the there's even some papers they claim there's an increased fertility, others say it can lead to spontaneous abortions, but I haven't looked up the effects on the fetal brain, for example. I don't know.
Right. Okay.
But the thing is, the placenta is very similar to the blood-brain barrier. It is unable to keep lipophilic chemicals out. So that drug will guaranteed affect the fetus.
And it'll be the same dose that your brain's receiving, won't it? So it'll affect the baby in a much higher dose relative to their...
It will get a blast too, because what goes to the placenta is just like the blood-brain barrier location. The spike in plasma concentration will lead to a rush of this compound across the placenta. In fact, one of my colleagues, Dan Rurak, he works at UBC. When I worked in the Faculty of Medicine, he was studying such things in sheep. They had catheters in the fetal circulation and in the fetal brain, and they could measure the absorbance of drugs across the sheep's placenta into, and the effects and so on.
So then I have a second one, which would be, how about secondhand smoke users, and did you address that?
I didn't, but I can tell you so much that it's all a matter of concentration. Good old Paracelsus, he's the father of pharmacology. He said the dose makes the poison. So obviously, if you sit in a very tiny room with 5 people who smoke big doobies, you probably inhale somewhat material that might have a slight effect on you. But
If you're in the
in
chair.
secondhand smoke, it is so small what you absorb. What did you say?
He said if you're on the chairlift behind somebody.
Yeah, the James Mountain there. Often my wife is very fond on this when somebody in the chair in front of us at the ski hill is smoking a joint going up.
Well, it was interesting because of secondhand smoke and tobacco, the qualities of that secondhand smoke being secondhand is far more toxic than was first ever evaluated, and now we're seeing that it's tobacco smoke secondhand is very toxic to.
I don't know about it. I'm sure it is a matter of concentration again.
Okay.
And again, in the past, have you ever been to Europe, or in many other places, in the old days in a pub where everybody smokes and there's lots of people, and if you work there as a bartender, while you are inhaling secondhand smoke at a significant level. But not too many people have jobs like that or hang out in places like that.
John, you mentioned the evolutionary background and potential origins of the cannabinoids, and I wonder about how and why did this system arise in a family of plants? Often terpenes evolve as resistance for herbivory from insects,
Yeah,
for
yeah.
example. Do we know whether the same receptors and effects are found, for example, on insects as in mammals? Or what do you know about the evolutionary background?
I know nothing about the last part of your question. So whether or not basically animals like insects who might harm the cannabis plants, if they have receptors for THC which deters them, so they consider that a poison. That's the principle for most plant-derived chemicals that have effects on animals. Basically, they can't run, they can't bite, they can't kick. So what do they do to defend themselves? They produce chemicals. And there's one large group of chemicals called alkaloids. You know many of them, caffeine, morphine, cocaine. So there's thousands of them, and many of which have strong effects on animals' nervous system. And so the reason why it is, the plants use amino acids to make those nitrogen-containing compounds. And no surprise, that's how we make neurotransmitters. So it's just a coincidence then they tinker with this in evolution, and it turns out not all alkaloids have powerful effects, but many do. So now the terpenes, that's another class of molecules made by us too. You make cholesterol in your liver. Cholesterol is a terpene. And by the way, all the nice fragrances of the conifers that you can smell, these are all terpenes. So many terpenes, again, are disliked by animals because they taste bad. We like their smell, right? But you wouldn't want to eat them, they taste awful. But then there are other smaller terpenes. They make all the flavors of eucalyptus, of lemons and limes, the peculiar odors, they're all terpenes. And it turns out that terpene actually does have an effect on our nervous system. I think in some way these are coincidences, but nature tinkers, and what works will be selected for. I'm sure if you Google this, you will quickly find whether or not insects are deterred by THC. I don't know.
Are cannabinoids found in other plants or just cannabis species?
Don't know. All these questions.
Those are the questions for the audience. Somebody else to take it away.
You mentioned, and I don't know if I misread it, that parts of cannabis actually improve certain aspects of memory, or was that just me misreading it?
No, that's the knockout mouse. So a knockout mouse actually memorizes more stuff than a normal mouse. That's the mouse where you remove any cannabis. So then the idea, by the way, this is the realm of neurobiology where we're guessing more than we really know. So, but the idea is when you remove the cannabis receptor, the mouse seems to retain memory that it normally would have erased. And it mainly seems to be short-term memory, which is probably a good thing that you don't memorize all this stuff. I mean, we know people that have a fabulous, well, Ever watched The Big Bang Theory? He claims he has an how did he call it? Does he call it? Pardon?
Photographic.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, you miss, or it went a bit too fast, so it's in the absence of the receptor.
That's kind of I'm thinking of the quantification. That's a mechanical measurement of the effect. What about on the process of thinking itself, or what would you call it that happens within the brain that's associated with thinking? Is there any enhancement, or what is the enhancement in impairment relative to the physical? I was thinking about I'm wondering about proteins here too, John. You were saying at the beginning that there's some questions still about how proteins are involved with memory, if I got that right.
Oh, there's a big question.
What's the story on that? How does one physical from the physical to the metaphysical? How does that happen?
Nobody
Still
knows.
up there,
We
It's
have
still
no
being
clue.
researched. Wow.
We have in fact, I love it. The more you learn about science, and I'm doing it for almost 40 years, the more you realize how much there is that we don't know and how this all works. And when it comes to things like brain function in terms of memory, you can do experiments in animals. You can block protein synthesis, and we know you must actually produce new compounds. It's not only that a memory might simply be viewed as, when you do this, that would be memory of doing sports, or you know how to write letters. You basically follow a certain pattern of neuronal activities. Same thing for thought. In fact, I have this every year. When I prepare my lecture, I do the same stuff again a year later. Sometimes I find myself, I should make a slide about this. And then I started looking in Google and make a slide, and then I advance it. I did the same thing last year. So the brain has gone through the exact same series of firings. But we know that's not all. There is also a laying down of proteins. But how this all works, we don't have a clue.
A mechanical question for you. You said that in Colorado there was a limit prescribed for driving, 5 nanograms per milliliter. Is that able to be assessed at a roadside
No,
test?
it's
Or you
another
have to take a
fascinating-
blood sample and it goes
It's
to the
another
lab?
fascinating problem. The only drug that we have where the police has a precise plasma level where they say, you can't drive, is alcohol. Any other medication, basically, they say it is so variable that the law says if you have such and such drug in your blood, you are illegal. They don't stipulate any level. So now with the pot becoming so much in recreational use, some places like Colorado and other states, they face the problem. Now, what do you do now? People are sky high and they're driving around. So they're trying to come up with this level. But the problem is, when you test people, it's extremely variable. Some people are just fine having 10, 20 nanograms in their blood and they drive very defensively. They're not dangerous. And other people are already impaired with less. It's the nature of the human diversity again. There's no defined level.
He was asking how they test for it.
Oh, they have a roadside testing device.
Blood testing.
No, it's not a blood test.
I understand there.
They have one. I've seen it, but I forgot. how
Police
it works.
departments are currently evaluating a
Yeah.
wide range of commercial gadgets, apparently, and I was just wondering if this had settled down in
Yeah, I didn't look it up how it works, but I doubt that they are allowed to take blood.
Can the same be said for alcohol too? For the amount of alcohol in your blood alcohol content doesn't necessarily directly relate to your impairment.
For the most part, it does. I mean, there are spectacular exceptions. In fact, I know the law in Germany, if they stop you and you drive and you have like 0.25% alcohol, what's our scale? Pardon? They use per mil, we use percent, right? So the numbers are off by a factor of 10. Anyway, 2.5 normally would be you're very intoxicated. Most people can't even stand. So when you are able to drive a car with this level, they consider you a real problem drinker. And they make you go through a whole regimen of treatment, et cetera, but they recognize there are differences in how people still function even though they have some level of impairment. We're not all the same. Yes?
Topical applications versus inhalant.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
People are, so The pharmacokinetics is so difficult, right? Smoking is not a good idea. Oral, actually orally also it has low bioavailability because everything you absorb from the gut, like orally taken drugs, first runs to the liver. And liver enzymes often deactivate already lots of the drug. It's called first pass effect. THC is a high first pass effect. Many drugs are almost useless orally because of that. So that's why spraying something in your mouth, like people with angina, they use nitro medication. You can absorb it in the oral cavity. That blood runs first to the whole body before it enters the liver. So, and dermal patches. Very few drugs work to diffuse through the skin into the blood. And so fentanyl works like this, and nicotine. So, but the vast majority of drugs don't. THC works. So there are actually patches in development which give you a very precise dose. It's very predictable, and well, you don't smoke it, so it's very controlled way. Look, we can handle fentanyl, as dangerous as it is, safely as patches. So, and yeah, might be on the market soon for THC.
A mud bath spa.
Pardon?
A mud bath spa.
John, thank you for walking us through this very complicated topic.
Thank you.
You've spoken here before, so I believe you have a UNBC mug, a notebook, and so here's a UNBC umbrella. Thank you so much. Please join us 2 weeks from now, and then we will have Derek Denholm speaking on talking trees and sentient landscapes. He resides locally after having worked for a number of years in the forest industry and having written a book on entitled Ground Truthing, in which he questions the industrial forestry model and asks for a new view of our forests. So hope to see you in 2 weeks. Thanks for coming in.